Hello, welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight we bring you a collection of accounts from men who thought they understood mountain roads until the passes themselves proved that understanding means nothing when you're alone at the wrong altitude. This is Blacktop Files, long-form horror stories that feel like true accounts from across the United States. Tonight we're focused on the Appalachian Mountain Passes, those narrow stretches of asphalt that cut through elevations where cell service dies, where weather turns without warning, and where the distance between two towns can feel like crossing into another world entirely. These aren't stories about getting lost or about car trouble. These are cases where something in the passes, something that uses the fog, the curves, the isolation, made contact with people who had no choice but to keep driving. What makes these accounts especially disturbing is the pattern. Different passes, different states, different years, but the same wrongness. The same sense that the road isn't quite following the map anymore, that the trees are watching, that something is pacing your vehicle just outside the headlight range. The men who experience these events aren't superstitious. They're drivers, workers, officers, people who know these mountains. And that's exactly why what happened to them is so hard to dismiss. If you want more horror that feels uncomfortably real, make sure to subscribe to Blacktop Files, turn on notifications so you never miss a file, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. State, city, or country. We want to know who's out there listening. Let's start with a route that one man drove for 6 years without incident, until the night the pass decided he'd driven it enough. I drove a delivery route through the southern Appalachians for a company that supplied auto parts to small-town garages. The route covered 4 counties, and the backbone of it was Highway 43, a 2-lane pass that rose and dropped through about 18 miles of national forest. I made that drive 3 nights a week, always between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., depending on how the earlier stops went. The pass wasn't scenic. It was work. Tight curves, no shoulder, no guardrails in some sections. And if you broke down up there, you were looking at a 2-hour wait for a tow, minimum. But it cut 90 minutes off the route compared to going around. And after 6 years, I knew every turn, every mile marker, every place where deer liked to cross. The night it happened was a Tuesday in late October. Clear sky, temperature in the low 40s, no wind. I'd finished my stop in Mercer around 11:30 and started the climb up to the pass. The first few miles were normal. My headlights on the white line, the radio playing low, the engine noise steady. About 4 miles in, I noticed my phone had no signal. That was normal for the pass. What wasn't normal was the way the radio started cutting out. Not static, just silence, like someone was turning the volume knob down and then back up, over and over. I switched it off. The road curved left, then right, then left again. Standard. But somewhere in that sequence, I realized I hadn't seen a mile marker in a while. I should have passed marker 16 about 2 minutes earlier. I kept my speed steady and watched for it. It never came. Instead, I passed marker 14. I'd already passed 14. I knew I had because 14 was right after a sharp hairpin turn that I'd cleared at least 5 minutes earlier. But there it was, lit up in my headlights. White text on a green post, clear as anything. Marker 14. I slowed down. Not because I thought I'd made a mistake, I knew I hadn't, but because I needed a second to think. Maybe the county had put up a duplicate marker by accident. Maybe I'd missed a turn somehow and looped back, though that made no sense because there were no turns, just the main road. I kept driving. The road curved right, climbing slightly, and my headlights swept across the trees. They were close on both sides, the kind of thick, autumn forest where the underbrush is too dense to see more than a few feet in. The leaves were still on the branches and they didn't move. No wind. A minute later, I passed marker 14 again. Same post. Same position on the right side of the road. Same angle. I stopped the van, put it in park, left the engine running, and sat there trying to make sense of it. The road behind me looked normal. The road ahead looked normal, but I'd just passed the same marker 3 times, and I was still climbing, still following the white line through the pass. I didn't want to turn around. Turning around meant adding 3 hours to the route, maybe more, and I'd have to explain it to my supervisor. But I also didn't want to keep going forward if the road was somehow looping, or if I was having some kind of medical episode. I decided to drive another mile. If I passed 14 again, I'd turn around, call it in, and deal with the fallback route. I put the van back in gear and started moving. The road curved left gently, and my headlights caught something on the shoulder ahead. A shape, low to the ground, too big to be a deer. I slowed down as I got closer. It was a backpack, just sitting there on the gravel, upright, like someone had set it down carefully. It was dark green, looked new, and it was zipped shut. I stopped next to it and rolled down my window. The air smelled wrong, not like rot or exhaust, just wrong, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the span of 10 feet, and the smell was the smell of that cold. It didn't smell like outside. It smelled like the inside of a freezer that hadn't been opened in years. I didn't get out. I looked at the backpack, and I looked at the trees, and I tried to decide if I'd seen it on one of my earlier passes of this section. I didn't think I had, but I also didn't trust my memory anymore, because I'd just driven past the same mile marker 3 times, and that wasn't something memory could fix. I rolled the window back up and kept driving. The next marker I saw was 12. I'd been driving uphill. 12 was lower in elevation than 14. I was going backwards. I stopped again, and this time I turned off the engine. I needed to hear what was outside. I needed to know if I was alone up here. The silence was immediate and total. No insects, no wind, no distant traffic. Just my breathing and the ticking of the cooling engine. I rolled the window down again, slowly, and listened. Footsteps. Not on the road, in the woods, to my left, maybe 20 feet back from the tree line. Steady, crunching through leaves and underbrush, moving parallel to the van. They were too heavy to be a deer and too evenly paced to be an animal. They sounded like boots. I started the engine and drove. I didn't speed, I didn't trust the curves, but I didn't stop again either. The footsteps faded behind me as I accelerated, and I focused on the road, looking for anything that would tell me I was still on Highway 43 and not on some logging road or detour I'd taken without realizing. Marker 10 appeared, then marker 8. I was still going backwards. The road ahead split. Not a turn, an actual fork. 2 lanes diverging into the trees, both of them paved, both of them with white lines. I'd driven this pass 150 times. There was no fork. There had never been a fork. I stopped the van in the middle of the road and stared at the split. The left lane curved slightly uphill and disappeared into the trees. The right lane stayed level and vanished into fog that hadn't been there a minute ago. Both lanes looked identical otherwise. Same asphalt, same line paint, same width. I didn't know which one was real. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, trying to figure out if I'd somehow missed this fork every other time I'd driven the pass, or if I was hallucinating, or if I was asleep in the van somewhere and this was a dream. None of those explanations fit. I felt awake. The steering wheel was solid under my hands. The dash lights were steady. I chose the left lane because it looked like it was still climbing, and I wanted to get to the top of the pass, where I knew there was a scenic pullout with a park service sign. If I could get there, I'd know where I was. The left lane curved uphill for about 30 seconds, and then it ended. Not at a turnaround or a gate. It just ended. The asphalt stopped in a clean line, and beyond it was dirt and leaves and the edge of the forest. No warning signs, no barriers, nothing. Just the end of the road. I stopped the van maybe 10 feet from the edge and put it in reverse. I didn't look at the trees. I didn't look at the dirt. I backed up until I could turn around, and then I took the right lane, the one with the fog. The fog was thick enough that my headlights barely cut through it. I dropped my speed to 15 miles per hour and followed the white line on the right side of the road because I couldn't see the left line anymore. The road stayed level, no curves, just a straight shot through fog that pressed against the windows like it was something solid. I drove like that for maybe 5 minutes, and then the fog cleared. I was at marker 23. I'd gone forward. I'd skipped from somewhere around 8 or 10 all the way to 23. 23 was only 2 miles from the end of the pass, from the point where the road dropped back down into the valley, and cell service came back and the next town started. I didn't question it. I sped up and focused on getting out. The road curved right, then left, and I passed marker 24 and then 25. I started to relax. My hands were cramping from how hard I'd been gripping the wheel. Marker 14, I was back. I didn't stop this time. I kept driving, and I watched the markers, and they kept moving backwards, 14, 12, 10, 8. The road was pulling me back up into the pass, back toward the fork, back toward whatever was out there in the trees. I tried the radio again, still nothing. I tried my phone, no signal, and the screen was dimmer than it should have been, like the battery was draining even though it had been at 70% when I started the climb. The fork appeared again, both lanes, same as before. This time I didn't stop. I took the right lane again, the one with the fog, because it had worked once. The fog swallowed the van, and I followed the white line, and I counted seconds in my head to keep myself calm. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The fog didn't clear. At 40 seconds, I saw lights ahead. Tail lights, red and dim, maybe 50 feet in front of me. Another vehicle, moving at about the same speed I was. I eased off the gas and kept my distance. I couldn't see what kind of vehicle it was. The fog was too thick. But the taillights were there, steady. And that meant I wasn't alone. That meant someone else was on this road. Someone else who was trying to get through. I followed the lights for maybe another minute, and then they went out. Not like the vehicle had turned or stopped, just out like someone had flipped a switch. I kept driving forward, expecting to see the vehicle on the side of the road, maybe pulled over with engine trouble. But there was nothing. No vehicle, no debris, no tire marks. Just the road and the fog. I stopped and turned on my high beams. They lit up the fog but didn't cut through it. I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. I sat there trying to decide if I should get out and check the road, but every part of me was screaming not to open the door. So I didn't. I put the van back in gear and kept moving forward. The fog cleared again. I was at marker 16. I'd been at 16 before, during the first loop. I was back in the middle of the pass. I don't know how long I drove after that. It felt like hours, but my phone, when I checked it, said it had only been 40 minutes since I'd entered the pass. 40 minutes of loops, of fog, of markers that didn't make sense, of that smell coming through the vents, even though I'd switched the air to recirculate. I tried every choice I could think of. I tried the left lane at the fork and hit the dead end again. I tried stopping and waiting to see if the road would reset itself. I tried driving with my headlights off to see if that changed anything. Nothing worked. Every choice led me back to the same markers, the same curves, the same fog, and the footsteps kept coming back. I'd hear them in the pauses between the engine noise, always to the left, always at the same distance, always steady. I never saw what was making them. At some point, I think it was around 1:30 a.m., though I'm not sure, I passed a sign I hadn't seen before. It was on the right side of the road, the same size and shape as a Parks Service sign, but the text was wrong. It didn't say the name of the pass or the elevation or anything useful. It just said, "Still climbing." That was when I stopped trying to make sense of it. I kept driving, and I stopped looking at the markers, and I focused on the white line and the feeling of the steering wheel under my hands and the sound of the engine. I drove until I didn't know where I was anymore, until the markers blurred together and the curves felt random, until I couldn't tell if I was going uphill or downhill, or if the road was even real. And then I came out the other side. I don't know how. One moment I was in the fog, following the white line, and the next moment I was past marker 28, which was the last marker before the pass ended. The fog was gone, the trees opened up. The road dropped into the valley, and I saw the lights of the next town ahead, tiny and distant but real. I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat in the parking lot with the engine running. My phone had signal again. The time was 3:15 a.m. I'd been in the pass for 3.5 hours. I called my supervisor and told him I'd had engine trouble, that I'd had to pull over and troubleshoot, and that I was behind schedule. He wasn't happy, but he didn't push it. I finished the route and drove home, and I didn't take Highway 43 again. I asked around carefully to see if anyone else had experienced anything strange on that pass. Most people looked at me like I was tired or making excuses for being late. One guy, another driver, older than me, drove a lumber route. Didn't look at me that way. He said he'd driven 43 once, years ago, and he'd taken the long way around ever since. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. I don't drive that route anymore. The company reassigned me after I kept requesting the fallback roads. But I still think about it. I think about the fork and the fog and the footsteps. I think about the taillights that disappeared. And I think about that sign, "Still climbing." Because I wasn't climbing, I was looping. But something wanted me to think I was still climbing, still moving forward, still making progress. I don't know what happens if you stop believing that. The next account comes from a state trooper whose patrol sector included a mountain pass where people called in disturbances that never quite matched the evidence he found. I worked as a state trooper in eastern Kentucky for 9 years, and for most of that time, my sector included Route 119, where it crosses through Martin County and into the hills. It's not a major highway, 2 lanes, scenic in the daytime, empty at night. My shift was usually 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., and I'd make 3 or 4 passes up and down 119, depending on what calls came in. The stretch I'm talking about is about 12 miles long, and it runs through a pass that cuts between 2 ridgelines. There's an overlook parking area near the top, and the road itself is steep enough that trucks have to gear down on the descent. In winter it gets treacherous, but in fall and spring it's just isolated. The calls started coming in during my second year on that sector. They were always the same type. Motorist assistance, someone reporting that they'd seen another vehicle stopped on the shoulder with hazard lights on, and when they'd pulled over to check, there was no one in the vehicle. Or the vehicle was gone by the time they got out of their car. Or the vehicle had been there, but the driver had seemed disoriented and wouldn't respond to questions. Dispatch would send me up to check, and I'd drive the pass from end to end, and I'd never find anything. No stopped vehicles, no abandoned cars, no disoriented drivers, just empty road. It happened often enough that I started noting the exact times and locations in my logbook. Over 6 months, I had 11 calls, all between midnight and 4 a.m., all on that same 12-mile stretch. No pattern to which direction the vehicles were facing or where on the pass they'd been seen. The only constant was that by the time I arrived, there was nothing to find. The dispatch supervisor started joking that the pass had a ghost car. I didn't joke about it. I just kept driving up there whenever the call came in, because even if it was nothing, someone had seen something, and it was my job to check. The night it happened to me was in November. Clear sky, cold, no traffic. I'd been on shift for about 4 hours and had just cleared a vehicle accident near the county line. Minor stuff, fender bender, no one hurt. Dispatch radioed me around 10:40 p.m. to say they'd gotten a call about a vehicle stopped in the northbound lane of 119, just past the overlook, hazards on, no driver visible. I acknowledged and headed up. It was about a 15-minute drive from where I was. I radioed dispatch again when I reached the base of the pass and started the climb. The road was empty. I passed 2 vehicles going the other direction, both of them moving at normal speed, no hazards. I reached the overlook and slowed down to check the parking area, empty. I kept going, scanning the shoulders, looking for any sign of a stopped vehicle. Nothing. I radioed dispatch and told them I wasn't seeing anything. They confirmed the caller had said it was just past the overlook, northbound lane. I told them I'd already passed that point and there was no vehicle. They said they'd log it as unfounded and I could clear. I didn't clear. I turned around at the next wide spot and drove back south, slower this time, checking both shoulders and both lanes. I wanted to make sure I hadn't missed something in the dark. Halfway back to the overlook, I saw the vehicle. It was in the northbound lane, pulled halfway onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. It was a small sedan, dark color, maybe a Honda or a Toyota. I couldn't see anyone inside. I pulled up behind it, turned on my light bar, and radioed my position to dispatch. I approached the vehicle on foot, using my flashlight to check the interior as I got closer. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger seat was empty. The back seat was empty. The keys were in the ignition and the engine was running. The hazard lights were on. The doors were locked. I tapped on the driver's side window with my flashlight and called out, asking if anyone was inside. No response. I circled the vehicle, checking for damage, for a flat tire, for anything that would explain why someone had pulled over and then left the car running with the doors locked. Nothing. The car was in perfect condition. The tires were fine, no fluids leaking. The only thing unusual was the smell, faint, coming from the vents maybe, like cold metal and something I couldn't place. It made my eyes water. I stepped back and looked at the tree line. The shoulder dropped off into a steep slope, thick with underbrush and trees. If someone had gone down there, I'd need a flashlight and probably backup. But I couldn't think of a reason why someone would leave a running car on the highway and climb down into the woods in the middle of the night. I radioed dispatch and requested a tow for an abandoned vehicle. They acknowledged and said a tow would be about 45 minutes. I stayed with the car, standing next to my cruiser with the light bar on, watching the tree line and the road. No one came back to the car. At some point, I don't remember exactly when, I noticed the temperature had dropped. Not gradually, but all at once, like I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. My breath was fogging and the windshield of the sedan started frosting over on the inside. Even though the engine was still running and the heat should have been on, I stepped closer to the sedan and used my flashlight to check the windows again. The frost was spreading across the inside of the glass in patterns that didn't look natural, too symmetrical, too deliberate. It looked like someone had traced designs in the frost with their finger, but the doors were locked and no one had been inside. I stepped back and radioed dispatch. I told them I needed that tow moved up if possible, and I needed them to run the plate. They ran it and told me the car was registered to a woman in Prestonsburg, about 30 miles north. No warrants, no flags. They asked if I wanted them to contact her. I said yes. While I waited, I walked the shoulder, looking for footprints or any sign that someone had climbed down into the woods. I didn't find any. The ground was hard and covered in leaves, but there should have been some disturbance if someone had gone down that slope. There wasn't. Dispatch radioed back. They'd contacted the registered owner. She said her car had been stolen from a grocery store parking lot 2 days earlier. She'd filed a report. She had no idea how it had ended up on Route 119. I stood there next to the sedan, staring at the frost on the windows, and I tried to make sense of it. Someone had stolen the car 2 days ago, driven it out to the pass, pulled over, left the engine running, locked the doors, and disappeared. No visible way off the road, no footprints, no disturbance in the woods, and the frost on the windows spreading in patterns that looked almost like letters. I didn't want to look at the patterns too closely. I didn't want to see if they actually spelled anything. I stood there with my back to the sedan and waited for the tow. The tow truck arrived about 20 minutes later. The driver got out, looked at the sedan, and asked me if I'd found the owner. I told him the situation, stolen vehicle, owner notified, no one on scene. He hooked up the car and started loading it onto the flatbed. While he was working, I walked back to my cruiser and sat in the driver's seat. I was cold in a way that didn't make sense. The heater was on and the air inside the cruiser was warm, but I couldn't stop shivering. I radioed dispatch and told them I was clearing the scene. They acknowledged. The tow truck pulled away, hauling the sedan, and I followed it down the pass until we reached the base and split off onto different routes. I didn't get another call for the rest of the shift. I drove my sector like normal, and I checked the overlook twice more before my shift ended, and both times it was empty. The next night, I got a call around 1 a.m. Motorist assistance, Route 119, just past the overlook. Vehicle stopped on the shoulder, hazards on, no driver visible. I acknowledged and drove up. Same stretch of road, same location, near as I could tell. No vehicle. I radioed dispatch and told them I wasn't finding anything. They confirmed the location with the caller, who was still on the line, and the caller insisted the vehicle was there. Northbound lane, just past the overlook. Hazards blinking. I told dispatch I was standing in that exact spot and there was no vehicle. Dispatch asked the caller to describe the vehicle. The caller said it was a small sedan. Dark color, maybe a Honda or a Toyota. I felt something tighten in my chest. I asked dispatch to confirm the plate number if the caller had gotten it. They asked. The caller hadn't. I cleared the call and sat in my cruiser at the overlook for maybe 10 minutes, trying to decide if I was losing my mind. The car I'd found the night before had been towed. I'd watched it leave, but someone was calling in the same car in the same location one night later. I drove the pass 3 more times that night. I didn't see anything, but I felt like I was being watched the entire time, like something in the trees was keeping pace with my cruiser, just far enough back that my headlights wouldn't catch it. I requested a transfer to a different sector 2 weeks later. My supervisor approved it without asking why. I don't patrol Route 119 anymore, but I still get calls sometimes from dispatch, patching through to my new sector by mistake, asking me to check on a stopped vehicle just past the overlook. I tell them it's not my sector anymore. They apologize and transfer the call to whoever has it now. I don't know what that trooper finds when he drives up there. I don't ask. Another file from the same mountain range, this one involving a maintenance worker whose job required him to check repeater towers on peaks that most people never see. I worked for a communications company that maintained cell towers and radio repeaters across 3 states. My territory covered the Central Appalachians, and most of the sites I serviced were on mountaintops or ridgelines, places you couldn't reach without a 4-wheel drive and a forestry service key for the access gates. The job was usually straightforward. Drive up the access road, check the equipment, replace anything that had failed, document the visit, and drive back down. Most sites I could get in and out of in under 2 hours. The site I'm talking about was called RT-17. It was a radio repeater on a peak in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, about 4,200 feet elevation. The access road was steep and rough, 6 miles from the nearest paved highway, and it switched back up through thick forest before breaking out into a clearing at the top where the tower sat. I'd been to RT-17 maybe a dozen times over 2 years. It was always the same, quiet, isolated, good view on clear days, and equipment that rarely had problems. The only thing I didn't like about it was the access road. It was narrow, rutted, and if you met another vehicle coming down while you were going up, one of you was backing up for half a mile. I got a service ticket for RT-17 in early December. The repeater was showing intermittent offline status, which usually meant a loose connection or a power issue. I scheduled the visit for a Tuesday afternoon, planning to get up there around 3 p.m. and be back down before dark. The drive up was normal, cold, overcast, no other vehicles. I unlocked the forest, service gate at the base of the access road, and started the climb. The road was in decent shape for winter. No ice, just hard-packed dirt and gravel. About halfway up, I noticed something on the side of the road. It was a coat hanging from a tree branch, like someone had draped it there deliberately. It was a bright orange hunting jacket, the kind with reflective strips, and it was clean. No dirt, no tears, just hanging there. I slowed down and looked at it. I didn't stop. I figured someone had left it while they were hiking, or maybe while they were working on the trail maintenance. But it bothered me because the access road wasn't a hiking trail, and I hadn't seen another vehicle. I kept driving. The road curved back and forth, climbing steadily, and I reached the clearing at the top around 3:15. The repeater tower was a 50-foot lattice structure with a small equipment shed at the base. The clearing was maybe 100 feet across, surrounded by dense forest. The view was socked in with low clouds, so I couldn't see the valleys below. I parked next to the shed and got out. The air was cold and still. No wind, no birds, no sound except the ticking of my truck engine as it cooled. I unlocked the shed and went inside to check the equipment. The repeater was running, but the power draw was fluctuating. I traced it to a loose connection in the battery backup system and tightened it. The status light stabilized. I logged the repair and closed up the shed. When I came back outside, the orange jacket was hanging on my truck's side mirror. I stopped and stared at it. It was the same jacket I'd seen on the tree branch halfway up the access road. I was sure of it. Same color, same reflective strips, same size. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't brought it up with me, and I'd been inside the shed for maybe 20 minutes. I looked around the clearing. No one, no other vehicles. No footprints in the dirt except mine and the tire tracks from my truck. Took the jacket off the mirror and held it. It was cold, colder than it should have been, from just hanging outside. The fabric was slightly damp and it smelled wrong, like the smell from a basement that's been closed up for years, damp and stale and metallic. I draped it over the hood of my truck and walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any sign that someone else was up there. I didn't find anything. The forest pressed in close on all sides, and the underbrush was too thick to see more than a few feet into the trees. I went back to the truck and got in. I put the jacket on the passenger seat, started the engine, and headed back down the access road. I'd gone maybe a mile when I saw the jacket again. It was hanging from a different tree branch, on the left side of the road this time, in a spot I'd already passed on the way up. Same jacket, same position, draped over the branch, like someone had placed it carefully. I stopped the truck and got out. I walked over to the siegeway jacket and touched it. It was real. The fabric was cold and damp, same as before. I looked back at my truck. The passenger seat was empty. I took the jacket off the branch and brought it back to the truck, and I checked the passenger seat to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The seat was empty. The jacket I'd put there was gone. I got back in the truck and locked the doors. I didn't put the jacket inside. I threw it in the truck bed and kept driving. Another mile down, the jacket was hanging from another tree. I didn't stop this time. I kept driving, and I watched the tree line, and I counted the switchbacks as I descended. The jacket appeared 3 more times, always on a tree branch, always ahead of me, always in a spot I was about to pass. I reached the bottom of the access road and stopped at the gate. I got out to close it, and I checked the truck bed. The jacket was still there, crumpled in the corner. I locked the gate and got back in the truck. I drove back to the highway, and I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was on pavement. When I got back to the shop, I checked the truck bed again. The jacket was gone. I filed my service report and noted the repair on RT-17. I didn't mention the jacket. I didn't know how to write that up in a way that wouldn't sound like I'd been hallucinating or making excuses. 2 weeks later, I got another ticket for RT-17. Equipment offline again, same issue, intermittent power. I told my supervisor I couldn't take that site anymore, that the access road was getting too rough for my truck. He reassigned it to another technician. That technician went up the next day. He came back and filed a report that said the equipment was fine, no issues. Status lights, all green. He said he didn't find any loose connections. He also said he'd found a jacket hanging on the equipment shed door. Orange hunting jacket, looked brand new. He'd left it there in case someone came back for it. I didn't ask him any more about it. I didn't want to know. But I did ask dispatch to pull the service logs for RT-17 going back 5 years. I wanted to see if anyone else had noted anything unusual. 3 different technicians had serviced that site over 5 years. 2 of them had noted finding clothing items near the tower. One found a pair of boots on the access road. Another found a hat hanging from the tower's base. Both of them had left the items where they'd found them. One technician had noted in his report that he'd heard footsteps in the woods while he was working, but when he'd checked, there was no one there. No one had followed up on any of it. It was just logged and forgotten. I don't service RT-17 anymore. I don't service any sites in that part of the range. I told my supervisor I needed to stay closer to the main highways, and he accommodated me. But sometimes I think about that jacket, and I think about the footsteps that technician heard, and I wonder if the clothing is still appearing up there, or if it's moved on to a different site. I wonder what it wants someone to do with it, because it's not random. It's not just lost clothing. It's being placed deliberately where people will see it. And every time you pick it up, it moves. I don't know what happens if you bring it all the way down the mountain. I don't think I want to find that out. The pattern continues with this next case, though the profession is different. A long-haul trucker whose route crossed the same pass 4 times a month, until one winter taught him why some roads are better left empty. I drove long-haul for 18 years, mostly the eastern routes. Boston down to Atlanta, sometimes out to St. Louis. One of my regular runs took me through West Virginia on Interstate 77, but when weather or traffic got bad on 77, I'd use an alternate route that cut through the mountains on US 19. It added maybe 40 minutes, but it was usually empty and the grades were manageable. The stretch I'm talking about is between Beckley and Summersville, where 19 goes through about 30 miles of mountain terrain. It's a good road, well maintained, 2 lanes most of the way, with occasional passing zones. In daylight, it's scenic. At night, it's just dark and quiet. I'd run that route maybe 4 times a month during winter, and I'd never had any problems. Good pavement, decent sightlines, no weird traffic. The only thing I didn't like was how empty it was. Sometimes I'd drive the whole 30-mile stretch without seeing another vehicle. The night it started was in early January. I was heading south, loaded with machine parts for a distributor in Charleston. I'd left Morgantown around 6 p.m., and I was planning to make Charleston by midnight, then grab a few hours of sleep before the morning delivery. I reached the 19 cutoff around 8:30. Traffic on 77 had been slow, so I took 19 to save time. The weather was clear, temperature in the 20s, no snow, good conditions. The first few miles were normal. My engine was running smooth, the trailer was tracking fine, and I had the radio on low. Some talk station, barely audible over the road noise. About 10 miles in, I saw headlights in my passenger side mirror. Another vehicle coming up behind me, moving fast. I kept my speed steady and watched the mirror. The headlights got closer, bright and high up, probably a pickup or an SUV. The vehicle pulled up alongside me in the passing zone and stayed there. It didn't pass. It just matched my speed, staying even with my cab for maybe 30 seconds. I glanced over, trying to see who was driving, but the windows were dark and the interior lights were off. I couldn't see anyone. The vehicle dropped back and disappeared behind me. I checked my mirrors, no headlights. It was just gone. I didn't think much of it. Maybe they'd turned off onto a side road I hadn't noticed. I kept driving. 5 miles later, the same headlights appeared in my mirror again. Same height, same brightness, coming up fast. The vehicle pulled alongside me again in the next passing zone and matched my speed. This time I got a better look. It was a pickup truck, dark color, maybe black or dark blue. The cab was empty, no driver, no passenger. Just an empty cab with the headlights on and the engine running, keeping pace with my truck like it was on cruise control. I stared at it for maybe 5 seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one in the driver's seat. The steering wheel wasn't moving. The truck was just gliding along next to me, perfectly straight, perfectly steady. I sped up. The pickup matched my speed. I slowed down. The pickup slowed down with me. I kept slowing until I was doing about 30 miles per hour, and the pickup stayed right alongside me the entire time. I leaned on my horn. The sound echoed through the mountains, loud and long. The pickup didn't react. It just stayed there, empty and silent, matching my speed. I drove, sped back up to 55 and focused on the road ahead. The pickup stayed with me for maybe another minute, and then it dropped back and disappeared again. I grabbed my CB and tried to raise anyone on Channel 19. No response. I switched to Channel 9 for emergencies and called out my location and what I was seeing. No response. Either no one was in range or my radio wasn't transmitting. I kept driving, my hands were shaking, and I was sweating even though the cab was cold. I told myself I'd imagined it, or I'd seen another driver slouched down low in the seat, or the angle had been wrong. I tried to rationalize it. 10 miles later, the headlights came back. This time the pickup pulled alongside me and stayed there for over a minute. I looked over and saw the cab again, empty just like before. But this time I noticed something else. The windows were fogging up from the inside, like there was warmth in the cab even though there was no one there. And the fog was forming patterns on the glass, slow and deliberate, like someone was drawing in it with their finger. I couldn't tell what the patterns were. I didn't want to know. I focused on the road and kept driving, and eventually, the pickup dropped back again. I was maybe 5 miles from Summersville when the headlights appeared for the 4th time. But this time, the pickup didn't pull alongside me. It stayed behind me, close, too close, maybe 20 feet off my bumper, and it started flashing its high beams. On and off, over and over. I sped up. The pickup stayed right on me. I hit 60, then 65, pushing my rig faster than I wanted to on those curves, and the pickup stayed locked to my bumper, high beams flashing. I saw a rest area ahead, just a small pullout with a couple of picnic tables and a trash can. I took it, pulling off hard and fast, and I watched my mirrors to see if the pickup would follow. It didn't. It kept going, headlights disappearing down the road. I sat in this rest area with the engine idling and the doors locked, and I tried to calm down. I told myself I'd lost it, that I'd been driving too long without a break, that I'd seen something normal and my brain had twisted it into something impossible. But I couldn't shake the image of that empty cab, and I couldn't stop thinking about the fog on the windows. I waited in the rest area for about 20 minutes, and then I got back on the road. I drove the last 5 miles into Summersville without seeing another vehicle, and I pulled into a truck stop and parked for the night. I didn't sleep. I sat in the cab with the lights on and the doors locked, and I went over what I'd seen, trying to find an explanation that made sense. The next morning, I asked the guy in the truck next to me if he'd driven 19 the night before. He said no, he'd come up on 77. I asked if he'd heard any chatter on the CB about a vehicle behaving strangely on 19. He said he hadn't. I finished my delivery in Charleston and took 77 back north. I didn't use 19 again that winter, but 2 months later, I got a call from another driver I knew, a guy who ran a similar route. He asked me if I'd ever seen anything weird on US 19 south of Summersville. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd been running that stretch 2 nights earlier, and he'd seen a truck, a big rig like mine, keeping pace with him in the passing zones, and when he'd looked over, the cab had been empty. I told him I'd seen something similar. He asked me what I thought it was. I told him I didn't know. He said he'd asked around at a truck stop in Beckley, and another driver had told him the same thing had happened to him about a year earlier. Same road, same empty vehicle, same high beams flashing. I don't run that route anymore. I stick to the interstates now, even when traffic is bad. It takes longer, but I'd rather sit in traffic than drive through those mountains alone at night. Because whatever that pickup was, it wasn't following the road. It was following me. And I don't know what would have happened if I'd stopped and let it catch up. This next account comes from a man whose job required him to monitor wildlife activity along remote stretches of highway, including sections where the state had installed warning systems for drivers. I worked for the State Department of Transportation in Virginia, specifically in the Wildlife Vehicle Collision Reduction Program. My job was to monitor sections of highway where deer strikes and other animal collisions were common, and to maintain the warning systems we'd installed, motion-activated signs that would light up when an animal crossed near the road. Most of my work was data collection and equipment maintenance. I'd drive the routes, check the sensors, download the data logs from the signs, and write up reports on collision frequency. It was outdoor work, a lot of driving, and most of it was during early morning or evening hours, when animal activity was highest. One of my routes included a stretch of U.S. Route 220 in Highland County, up near the West Virginia border. It's mountain terrain, heavily forested, and the road runs through a pass that's about 9 miles long. We'd installed 4 warning signs along that stretch after a bad year where we'd had over 30 deer strikes in 6 months. The signs worked most of the time. They'd detect motion in the sensor range, usually about 50 feet into the tree line, and they'd light up with a flashing yellow deer symbol to warn drivers. The data logs would record every activation, along with a timestamp and a duration. I'd been monitoring that route for about a year, checking the signs once a week, and the data was pretty consistent. Most activations were between dusk and dawn, clustered around the times you'd expect deer to be moving. The logs matched what I saw on the road: deer tracks, scat, occasional sightings. The anomaly started showing up in October. I downloaded the data, logs from the 4 signs, and I noticed that one of them, sign 3, located near the midpoint of the pass, was activating at irregular times. Not the usual dusk-dawn pattern, but scattered activations throughout the night, sometimes every 15 minutes, sometimes with hours of gaps. That wasn't normal. Deer don't move in patterns like that. They have feeding and bedding routines, and while they're not predictable down to the minute, they don't usually trigger a sensor every 15 minutes for 3 hours straight and then go silent. I flagged the data and drove out to check the sign. I thought maybe the sensor was malfunctioning, picking up wind-blown branches or something else that wasn't an animal. I reached sign 3 around 7 a.m. It was a cold morning, overcast, with fog sitting low in the trees. The sign was mounted on a post on the right side of the road, facing southbound traffic. The sensor was a small unit, mounted on top of the sign housing, angled toward the tree line. I parked on the shoulder and got out to inspect it. The sensor looked fine. No damage, no debris, no obstructions. I ran a manual test by walking into the sensor range, and the sign lit up immediately, flashing the yellow deer symbol. The sensor was working. I checked the area around the sign, looking for anything that might be causing false activations. No low-hanging branches, no tall grass, nothing that would move in the wind and trigger the sensor. I reset the data log and decided to leave a trail camera in the area to see what was actually triggering the sensor. I mounted the camera on a tree about 20 feet from the sign facing the sensor range, and I set it to record whenever it detected motion. I came back a week later and downloaded the footage. The camera had recorded over 300 clips. Most of them were deer, normal activity, deer crossing through the sensor range at various times of night. But there were about 40 clips that didn't show any animals. Those clips showed the sensor activating, flashing on the sign visible in the corner of the frame, but the sensor range was empty. No deer, no other animals, nothing moving in the trees. Just empty forest and the sign lighting up. I watched those clips several times, trying to see if I was missing something. Maybe a bat flying low, or an owl, or some small animal that wasn't visible in the frame. But the sensor was designed to ignore small animals. It was calibrated for deer-sized motion, and it had a height threshold to filter out ground-level activity, like raccoons or possums. I couldn't explain it. I flagged the sign for a full sensor replacement and scheduled it for the following week. Before the replacement, I decided to sit in my truck near the sign for a few hours, one night, and watch it in person. I wanted to see if I could observe whatever was triggering it. I parked on the shoulder about 100 feet south of the sign around 10 p.m. It was a clear night, cold, no wind. I had a good view of the sign and the tree line, and I kept my window cracked so I could hear anything moving in the woods. For the first hour, nothing happened. The sign stayed dark. I saw 2 cars pass, both heading north, and both drivers slowed down when they saw my truck on the shoulder. I waved them on. At 11:15, the sign lit up. I looked at the tree line. I didn't see anything. No movement, no deer, no shape crossing through the sensor range. The sign flashed for about 10 seconds, then went dark again. I got out of the truck and walked over to the sign. I stood in the sensor range and looked into the woods, using my flashlight to scan the underbrush. Nothing. No tracks, no fresh disturbance, no animals. I went back to my truck and sat down. 10 minutes later, the sign lit up again. Same thing, no visible trigger, just the sign flashing in the darkness. Over the next 2 hours, the sign activated 8 more times. I watched the tree line with binoculars. I used a thermal imaging monocular I kept in my equipment bag. I walked the sensor range 3 more times. I never saw anything that could have triggered the sensor. But on the 4th activation, I heard something. It was faint, and it was coming from the woods on the left side of the road opposite the sign. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through leaves and underbrush. The steps were too heavy to be a deer, and they were too evenly paced to be an animal moving naturally. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The footsteps continued, moving parallel to the road, staying just inside the tree line. I couldn't see what was making them. The trees were too thick, and the darkness was absolute beyond the reach of my truck's headlights. The footsteps stopped. The sign lit up again. And then I heard the footsteps on the right side of the road where the sensor was. They'd crossed the road. I hadn't seen anything cross. I'd been watching the road the entire time. But the footsteps were now on the right side, moving through the sensor range, and the sign was flashing. I got back in my truck and locked the doors. I started the engine and turned on my high beams, flooding the tree line with light. I didn't see anything. The footsteps had stopped. I sat there for maybe 5 more minutes and then I left. I drove back to the district office and wrote up my observations, noting the unexplained activations and the sounds I'd heard. I didn't mention that I thought something had crossed the road without being visible. I didn't know how to write that in a way that wouldn't sound like I was unfit for duty. The sensor was replaced the following week. The new sensor worked fine for about 2 weeks, and then the same activation pattern started appearing in the logs. Irregular triggers, no visible animals on the trail camera footage, same time range, late night clustered around the midpoint of the pass. I requested a meeting with my supervisor and showed him the data. He looked at it, looked at the camera footage, and told me to disable the sign. He said if the sensor was malfunctioning and we couldn't fix it, we'd just leave it offline until the budget allowed for a full system upgrade. I disabled the sign and I stopped monitoring that stretch of 220. Another technician took over the route. 2 months later, that technician filed a report about sign 3. He'd re-enabled it to test the new sensor, and he'd spent a night watching it from his truck. He reported hearing footsteps in the woods, and he reported seeing the sign activate with no visible trigger. He also reported seeing something else. He said that during one of the activations, he'd seen a shape moving through the sensor range, human-sized, upright, but wrong in a way he couldn't describe. He said it had moved across the road and into the tree line on the opposite side, and the sign had stayed lit the entire time it was crossing. He requested a transfer to a different route. It was approved. Sign 3 is still offline. The data logs from before it was disabled are still in the system, and if you look at them, you can see the pattern. Irregular activations scattered through the night, always in that same 9-mile stretch of road. I don't work that route anymore. I don't go near that pass unless I have to. But I think about those footsteps, and I think about the shape that technician saw, and I wonder if the signs were ever really malfunctioning. I think they were working exactly as designed. I think they were detecting something moving through the sensor range. I just don't think it was a deer. The pass takes different forms in different parts of the range. This next case involves a delivery driver whose route included a shortcut that saved time but demanded something in return. I drove a delivery route for a restaurant supply company based out of Roanoke. The route covered the mountain towns in southwest Virginia, places like Floyd, Galax, and Independence. Most of the deliveries were to small diners and restaurants that couldn't get same-day service from the bigger distributors. The route was about 200 miles round trip, and I ran it 3 times a week. The main roads were fine, but there was one stretch where I'd use a shortcut to save about 30 minutes. It was a county road that cut through a pass between 2 ridges, narrow and winding but well paved. Locals called it Tanner Grade, though I never saw it marked on any map. I'd been using that shortcut for about 8 months, and I'd never had any issues. The road was always empty, and the pavement was good. The only thing I didn't like was how dark it got at night. No street lights, no houses, just trees pressing in close on both sides. The first time I noticed something wrong was in late November. I was running late on my deliveries, and I didn't reach Tanner Grade until after 8 p.m. It was a cold night, no moon, and the road was slick with frost. About halfway through the pass, I saw something on the shoulder. It was a cardboard box, sitting upright, like someone had placed it there carefully. I slowed down and looked at it as I passed. It was a standard moving box, sealed with packing tape, and it had something written on the side in black marker. I couldn't read it in the time it took me to drive past. I didn't stop. I figured someone had dropped it off a truck or left it there by mistake. But it bothered me because the road was so isolated. There were no houses nearby, no driveways, no reason for someone to leave a box on the shoulder. I finished my deliveries and drove back through the pass around 10 p.m. The box was still there, in the same spot, same position. I slowed down again and tried to read the writing on the side. This time I could make out a few words. Open if alone. I didn't stop. I kept driving, and I told myself it was a prank or some kind of art project. But the words stayed with me, open if alone, like the box was meant for someone specific, someone who met that condition. I drove the route again 2 days later. Same schedule, same timing. I reached Tanner Grade around 8:30 p.m. and the box was still there. It had moved. Not far, maybe 20 feet closer to the road, like someone had dragged it from the shoulder into the lane. It was still upright, still sealed, still with the same writing on the side. I drove past it and watched my rearview mirror. The box didn't move. It just sat there, dark and still, shrinking in the distance as I climbed toward the top of the pass. I finished my deliveries and came back through the pass around 10:15. The box was in the middle of the road. I had to stop. I couldn't drive around it. The road was too narrow and the shoulders dropped off steeply into the woods. I put the van in park, left the engine running, and got out. The box was sealed. The tape was intact, and the writing was clear. Open if alone, and below it, in smaller letters, you'll need it. I stood there looking at the box, trying to decide if I should open it or move it off the road. Every part of me was screaming not to touch it, but I also couldn't leave it there. If another vehicle came through, they'd hit it, or they'd have to stop just like I had. I picked up the box. It was light, maybe 5 or 10 pounds, and something inside shifted when I lifted it. It didn't feel like books or tools. It felt like loose objects, maybe wrapped in paper or fabric. I carried the box to the shoulder and set it down. I got back in the van and kept driving. The next time I drove the route, 3 days later, the box was back in the middle of the road. I stopped again. This time I opened it. Inside were clothes, a jacket, a pair of gloves, a knit hat, and a folded blanket. They were clean, neatly folded, and they looked new. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten note on a piece of lined paper. It said, "You will need these before you reach the end." I read the note twice. I looked at the clothes. They were my size, the jacket, the gloves, even the hat. I didn't know how that was possible. I hadn't ordered these. I didn't know anyone who would have left them here. I put the note back in the box and closed it. I moved the box back to the shoulder and got back in the van. I didn't take the clothes. I didn't want to, but I also couldn't stop thinking about the note. You will need these before you reach the end. I drove the rest of the pass without seeing anything else unusual. I finished my deliveries and came back through around 10 p.m. The box was gone. 2 weeks later, I was running the same route, and I reached Tanner Grade around 9 p.m. The weather had turned, temperature in the teens, wind picking up, and snow starting to fall. The van's heater was running full blast, but I was still cold. My hands were stiff on the wheel, and I could see my breath fogging the windshield. About halfway through the pass, the van started losing power. The engine sputtered, the dashboard lights flickered, and the heater cut out. I pulled onto the shoulder and tried to restart it. Nothing. The battery was dead. I sat there in the dark, in the cold, and I realized I was in serious trouble. It was snowing harder now, and the temperature was dropping. I didn't have a heavy coat in the van, just a light windbreaker that wouldn't be enough if I had to walk out. My phone had no signal. The road was empty. I got out and opened the hood, hoping it was something simple like a loose battery cable. It wasn't. The battery terminals were corroded and frozen, and I didn't have the tools to clean them properly. I was about to start walking when I saw something on the shoulder ahead. It was the box. It was sitting upright, maybe 50 feet in front of the van, right where I'd left it 2 weeks earlier. The snow was falling around it, but the box was clean. No snow on top, no frost like it had just been placed there. I walked over to it and opened it. The clothes were still inside, folded neatly, still clean. The note was still at the bottom. I put on the jacket. It fit perfectly. I put on the gloves and the hat, and I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders. The cold backed off immediately. The clothes were warm in a way that didn't make sense, like they'd been sitting in front of a heater, even though they'd been in a box on the side of a frozen road. I started walking. The van was dead, and I didn't have any other choice. The nearest town was about 4 miles north, back the way I'd come. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, and I didn't get cold. The jacket, the gloves, the blanket. They kept me warm, even though the wind was cutting through the pass and the snow was coming down hard enough that I could barely see the road. I reached the edge of the pass and saw headlights coming toward me. A truck, moving slow, hazards on. The driver pulled over and asked if I needed help. I told him my van had broken down and I needed a tow. He said he'd call it in when he got back to town, and he offered me a ride. I got in the truck and we drove back through the pass. When we reached the spot where I'd left the van, it was gone. The driver slowed down and looked at me. He asked where the van was. I told him it had been right there, on the shoulder, about 50 feet past a cardboard box. He said he hadn't seen a box. He said he hadn't seen a van either. We drove the rest of the pass, and we didn't find the van. The driver dropped me off in town, and I called my supervisor and reported the van stolen. The police filed a report, and my company opened an insurance claim. The van was found 2 days later. It was in a Walmart parking lot in Galax, about 15 miles from where I'd left it. The keys were in the ignition, the battery was fine, and there was no sign of forced entry or damage. It was like someone had driven it off the mountain and parked it there. You never drove Tanner Grade again. I requested a different route, and my supervisor approved it without asking why. But I still have the jacket. I kept it, even though I know I shouldn't have. It's hanging in my closet, and sometimes I take it out and look at it. And I try to remember if I actually walked out of that pass, or if something else happened that I've convinced myself was real. Because the more I think about it, the less sense it makes. The box appearing exactly when I needed it. The clothes fitting perfectly. The van disappearing and reappearing 15 miles away. I don't think I walked out. I think something else carried me out, and it let me keep the jacket so I'd remember. We're past the halfway point now, and the accounts are getting harder to dismiss. This one comes from a surveyor whose job required him to map old logging roads that hadn't been used in decades. I worked as a land surveyor for a forestry management company. Most of my work involved mapping property, boundaries, timber access roads, and old infrastructure that had been left behind when the logging operations shut down in the 70s and 80s. The Appalachians are full of old roads that used to service camps, mills, and equipment depots, and most of them have been reclaimed by the forest. My job was to locate these roads, document their condition, and update the company's maps. Sometimes the roads were still passable, sometimes they were overgrown, and sometimes they'd washed out completely. I'd hike in with a GPS unit, a machete, and a camera, and I'd spend the day tracing the old routes. The road I'm talking about was in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. It was marked on a 1960s-era Forest Service map as Camp 12 Access, and it ran about 3 miles from a state highway up to a ridgeline where a logging camp used to sit. The company wanted it surveyed to see if it could be reopened for timber access. I started the hike around 8 a.m. on a clear day in September. The trailhead was easy to find, just a gap in the trees off the highway, with old tire ruts still visible under the grass and weeds. The road climbed steadily, winding up through thick forest, and it was in better shape than I'd expected. Most of the surface was intact, and the grades weren't too steep. I followed the road for about a mile, taking photos and marking waypoints on my GPS. The forest was quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots on the dirt and the rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. At the 1 mile mark, I found the first structure. It was a concrete foundation, maybe 20 feet square, with rusted anchor bolts sticking up from the corners. Probably an old equipment shed or a generator building. I documented it and kept moving. Half a mile later, I found another foundation and then another. The road was lined with them, small concrete pads where buildings had once stood. Some of them still had partial walls or collapsed roofs, but most were just empty slabs with weeds growing through the cracks. I reached the 2-mile mark and stopped to check my map. According to the old Forest Service documents, the logging camp should have been another mile ahead at the top of the ridge, but I was starting to see signs that didn't match the map. There were too many foundations. The map showed Camp 12 as a small operation, maybe 10 or 12 buildings total, but I'd already counted over 20 foundations, and I was still a mile away from the camp's marked location. I kept hiking. The road curved left, then right, and I noticed the forest was changing. The trees were older here, bigger, and the underbrush was thinner. It felt like I'd crossed into a section of the forest that had been left alone for longer than it should have been. At the 2.5-mile mark, I found the first sign. It was a wooden post, weathered and leaning, with a hand-painted sign nailed to it. The paint was faded, but I could still read it. Camp 12, no entry, after dark. I took a photo of the sign and looked at the road ahead. It continued climbing, disappearing around a curve. I checked my watch. It was just past noon. I had plenty of daylight left. I kept moving. The road leveled out as I reached the ridgeline, and I saw the camp. It was bigger than the map had indicated, much bigger. There were at least 40 structures, most of them collapsed or overgrown, but some still standing. The main buildings were clustered around a central clearing, and the access road looped through the site in a rough circle. I walked into the clearing and stopped. Something was wrong. The buildings were too intact. This camp had been abandoned in the early 70s, over 50 years ago. But the structures looked like they'd been left maybe 10 or 20 years ago, not 50. The roofs were sagging, but not collapsed. The walls were weathered, but not rotted through. And there were no trees growing through the floors. No saplings pushing up through the foundations. It was like the forest had stopped reclaiming the site. I walked over to the nearest building and looked through a broken window. The interior was dark, but I could see furniture. Chairs, tables, a filing cabinet. They were rusted and covered in dust, but they were still there. I took photos and documented the main clearing, and then I started walking the loop road to check the other structures. Most of them were bunkhouses or storage sheds, all in the same state of partial decay. But near the far end of the loop, I found a building that didn't match the others. It was larger, maybe 30 feet wide and 50 feet long, and it had a heavy steel door that was still closed. The windows were boarded up, and there was a chain wrapped around the door handles, secured with a rusted padlock. I took photos of the building and checked my map. It wasn't marked. None of the structures on this loop were marked. The map showed the main camp area, but it didn't show this extension. I walked around the building, looking for another way in. The boards on the windows were nailed tight, and the rear door was also chained. I didn't have bolt cutters, and I didn't want to force entry without clearance from the company. I was about to leave when I heard the sound. It was faint, coming from inside the building. A low rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged across a floor. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, and then it stopped. I stepped back from the building and listened. Silence. I told myself it was the wind, or an animal that had gotten inside through a gap I hadn't seen. But the building was sealed. There were no gaps. The doors were chained and the windows were boarded. I checked my watch. It was 2:30 p.m. I had plenty of time to finish the survey and hike back out before dark. I decided to skip the locked building and finish documenting the rest of the site. I walked the loop road, taking photos and marking waypoints, and I tried to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I finished, It was almost 4 p.m. The sun was still up, but the shadows in the clearing were getting longer. I packed up my gear and started back down the access road. I'd gone maybe half a mile when I noticed the signs. There were more of them now, lining the road at regular intervals. They were all the same: wooden posts, hand-painted signs, same faded text. Camp 12, no entry after dark. I hadn't seen these signs on the way up. I was sure of it. I documented the route carefully, and there had only been one sign near the 2.5-mile mark. I kept walking, moving faster now. The signs kept appearing, one every 100 feet or so, all of them warning about entering after dark. I checked my watch. It was 4:30. Sunset wasn't until 7. I had plenty of time. The road curved left, and I saw another sign. This one was different. The text was fresher, like it had been painted recently. It said, "You should have left earlier." I stopped and stared at the sign. The paint was bright red, still glossy, like it hadn't dried yet. I reached out and touched it. My finger came away clean. The paint was dry. I started running. The road blurred past me as I descended, and I didn't stop to check the GPS or take photos. I just ran, following the ruts and the tire tracks, focusing on getting back to the highway. The signs kept appearing, faster now, every 50 feet, then every 20 feet. The text changed with each one. "You shouldn't be here. Camp 12 is closed. Turn back." I reached the 1-mile mark and slowed down to catch my breath. I looked back up the road. The signs were gone. The forest was quiet again. No wind, no sound. I kept moving, walking now, and I reached the trailhead just as the sun was starting to drop behind the ridge. My truck was where I'd left it, and I got in and locked the doors and sat there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to slow my breathing. I filed my survey report the next day. I documented the access road, the foundations, and the main camp structures. I didn't mention the locked building, and I didn't mention the signs. I recommended that the road not be reopened. I said the site was too unstable, that the structures were hazardous, and that the Forest Service should be contacted before any work was done. My supervisor accepted the report, and the company dropped the project. I never went back to Camp 12, but I've thought about it. I've thought about that locked building, and the sound I heard inside, and the signs that appeared on the road. And I've thought about the last sign I saw, the one I didn't include in my report. It was at the trailhead, nailed to a tree right next to where my truck was parked. I saw it when I was getting in, and I didn't stop to take a photo. I just read it and left. It said, "We'll see you next time." The final account are the hardest to hear. This account comes from an emergency responder whose calls took him into the pass at hours when most people know better than to be on the road. I worked as a volunteer EMT for a rural rescue squad in northwest North Carolina. Our coverage area included about 400 square miles of mountain terrain, and most of our calls were vehicle accidents, heart attacks, or falls. Response times were long, sometimes 45 minutes or more from dispatch to arrival, and we worked closely with state troopers and the local fire department. One of the most difficult areas to cover was a section of Highway 421 that ran through a pass between Boone and Mountain City. It was a high-elevation road, narrow and winding, and it was notorious for accidents. We called it Dead Man's Curve, though the official name was just the 421 corridor. I'd run calls on that stretch maybe 30 times over 4 years. Most of them were routine. Single vehicle accidents, usually weather-related, usually no serious injuries. But there was one call that I still can't explain, and it's the reason I stopped volunteering. The call came in around 2 a.m. on a Saturday in February. Dispatch reported a vehicle accident on 421 northbound lane, approximately 2 miles south of the Tennessee line. Single vehicle, possible ejection. Caller reported seeing someone on the road. I responded with my partner, and we took the squad's ambulance up from the station in Boone. The roads were clear, no ice, no snow, but the temperature was in the low 20s and the wind was gusting hard enough to rock the ambulance on the curves. We reached the reported location about 20 minutes after dispatch. There was no vehicle, no debris, no tire marks, no sign of an accident. We radioed dispatch and asked for clarification on the location. Dispatch confirmed the coordinates and said the caller had been specific. Northbound lane, 2 miles south of the state line, near mile marker 73. We were at mile marker 73. There was nothing there. We drove north slowly, scanning both shoulders and both lanes. At mile marker 74, we saw the vehicle. It was a sedan, sitting in the middle of the northbound lane, facing south. The engine was off, the doors were closed, and the headlights were off. There was no visible damage, no skid marks, no indication that it had been in an accident. We parked behind it and got out. My partner approached the driver's side while I checked the passenger side. The vehicle was empty. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the accessory position. The interior was cold, no residual heat from the engine. The seats were empty, and there was no blood, no belongings, nothing that suggested someone had been inside recently. I radioed dispatch and reported an abandoned vehicle. They asked if we'd found the patient. I told them no, and I asked if they could contact the original caller for more information. Dispatch tried. The caller didn't answer. We searched the area around the vehicle, using flashlights to check the coast, shoulders, and the tree line. We called out, identifying ourselves as EMTs, asking if anyone needed help. No response. My partner found footprints in the gravel on the shoulder. They led from the driver's side of the sedan toward the tree line, and then they stopped. Not at the edge of the trees. They stopped about 10 feet short in the middle of the gravel, like whoever had been walking had just disappeared. We followed the direction the footprints had been heading and searched the tree line for maybe 50 feet in both directions. We didn't find anything. No signs of someone entering the woods. No disturbed underbrush. No additional tracks. A state trooper arrived about 10 minutes later. We briefed him on what we'd found, and he ran the plate on the sedan. It came back registered to a man in Johnson City, Tennessee. The trooper tried calling the number on the registration. No answer. The trooper decided to have the vehicle towed, and he cleared us to return to service. We packed up and headed back down the pass. We were about a mile south of the sedan when we got another call. Same location. Mile marker 74, vehicle accident, possible ejection, caller reporting someone on the road. I radioed dispatch and told them we just cleared that location and there had been no patient. Dispatch confirmed the call was new. Different caller, same report. We turned around and headed back up. The trooper was still on scene when we arrived, standing next to the sedan, and he waved us over. He said he'd just gotten a call on his radio from dispatch, asking him to check for a patient in the area. I told him we'd gotten the same call. He said he'd been standing there the entire time we'd been gone, and he hadn't seen anyone. We searched the area again, this time with the trooper's help. We covered a wider range, checking farther into the tree line, looking for any sign that someone had been there. We found nothing. The tow truck arrived, and the driver loaded the sedan onto the flatbed. The trooper followed the tow truck down the mountain, and my partner and I stayed for a few more minutes, just to make sure we weren't missing something. I was walking back to the ambulance when I heard the voice. It was faint, coming from the woods on the left side of the road. It sounded like someone calling for help, but the words were unclear, muffled, like they were coming from a distance or through a barrier. I stopped and listened. My partner heard it too. We grabbed our medical bags and moved toward the tree line, calling out to identify ourselves. The voice stopped. We waited, listening, and then we heard it again. This time it was behind us, on the right side of the road. Same voice, same tone, calling for help. We turned and moved toward the right side. The voice stopped again. This happened 3 more times. The voice would call out from one direction. We'd move toward it, and it would stop and then resume from a different direction. It was like it was leading us in circles. My partner said we should leave. He said something wasn't right, and we shouldn't be out here alone. I agreed. We got back in the ambulance and radioed dispatch. I told them we were clearing the scene, that we'd completed a thorough search and found no patient. Dispatch acknowledged. We drove back down the pass, and neither of us spoke for the first few miles. Finally, my partner said he'd heard stories about that stretch of road, stories from other responders, about calls that didn't make sense, about voices in the woods, about vehicles that disappeared. I asked him why he hadn't mentioned it before. He said he hadn't believed the stories until tonight. We got another call for the same location 2 nights later. Different crew responded. They reported the same thing: abandoned sedan, no patient, footprints that stopped in the middle of the shoulder. The sedan was never claimed. The registered owner was contacted, and he said the car had been stolen from his driveway 3 weeks earlier. He'd filed a police report, and he had no idea how it had ended up on Highway 421. I stopped volunteering a month later. I told the squad I was moving out of the area, but that wasn't true. I just couldn't respond to calls on that pass anymore, because I keep thinking about the voice, and the footprints that stopped, and the way the sedan was sitting in the middle of the road like someone had placed it there. I think whatever is in that pass wants people to stop. It wants them to get out of their vehicles, to search the woods, to follow the voices. I don't know what happens if you follow them far enough. I don't want to find out. That's where the files end for tonight. 8 cases, 8 passes, 8 men who drove or walked or rode into the mountains and came back changed. The passes are still there, the roads are still open, and people still use them because they're faster, because they're convenient, because they don't know any better. But now you do. If you found this uncomfortably real, subscribe to Blacktop Files and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? We want to know who's out there, and if you're planning to drive through a mountain pass after dark, maybe take the long way around instead. Some roads don't want you to leave.